Alright, welcome back to our series here on YouTube. We're going to look at today Chapter 11, The Age of Imperialism, Section 2, Types of Imperialism, a Case Study of Nigeria and Resistance in the Colonies there. These are all subjects that we will touch upon at some point today. And I should note, by the way, that since you're out of school today, this is actually when I'm recording this, is on Tuesday, February 24th, so hence the date. You will probably see this in class if you are there. We don't have a delay. I should probably just start calling this series the Mr. Berry and all of his classes are on ice and snow and cold delay history notes extravaganza. Alright, let's get started. First, let's look at a new period of imperialism. Okay, so during the scramble for Africa, European nations demanded a lot more influence over the lives of their colonial subjects. They really wanted to fundamentally change the lives of the people living in Africa. They wanted to specifically have control of all the aspects of their life, the things that they did, what went on, where they lived, and they wanted to use these colonies to benefit the Europeans. The Europeans wanted these colonies to benefit them. Especially, they wanted to make a lot of money, and so they wanted to improve European economies. They didn't really care about what went on in the economies of the Africans, but they really did want these things to benefit them. It's very selfish, but that was pretty much the outlook. And thirdly, they wanted Africans to adopt European customs and culture. They wanted to change a lot of the governments that are going on there. They wanted to change the religion of the people who were living there. They wanted to pretty much change everything about Africans and make them more like Europeans. Now, the first subject that we're going to talk about, again, we're going to look at types of imperialism, a case study of Nigeria, and resistance in colonies. But we want to look at sort of the types of imperialism and the sorts of government that are present in Africa during and shortly after the scramble for Africa. Many European nations were involved in Africa, and there are several different forms of control. We're going to talk about two kinds of imperialism in a moment, but we want to look at the kinds of governments or setups that there were to control countries in Africa and around the world, for that matter. The first of these is going to be called the colony. We are in America, of course, we're probably familiar with the colony system. The United States starts as a series of colonies, and what a colony is it's a area governed by a foreign power. The example I've given here is French Somalia, because it is a French colony. They are governed directly by the French government. But another good example would, of course, be South Carolina, North Carolina, all the other original 13 colonies of the United States. They're specific areas that were governed by Great Britain. Okay, so they're governed pretty much directly by a foreign outside power, someone that is not, in fact, where they are. The second kind is going to be a protectorate. This is a territory or country that does govern itself, but it governs itself under outside control. A good example of this is Britain with Nigeria. Nigeria did have its own government, but it had some oversight by Britain. Britain would come in and make sure everything was going smoothly. If they didn't like something that was occurring in the government of Nigeria, they would in fact step in. But Nigeria did have its own solvent individual government. So it did govern itself, but under the control of Britain. The third one is going to be sphere of influence. And sphere of influence is you have an outside power controlling or investing in the trading of an area, but there is no real control over the government. The government there can do whatever it wants, but it is influenced by another power. A good example of this is the United States and Liberia. Liberia does have its own government. It is not controlled by anyone else. It can do whatever it wants. But the United States does exert some interest and influence there because we have a lot of trading ties with Liberia. Liberia is actually established as a place for formerly enslaved peoples to go live after the Civil War, and a lot of them do move there, and so Liberia is actually remarkably America-like, if you want to look at it that way. There are a lot of American cultural aspects if you go there. It's sort of surprising, actually, but the United States does have a lot of influence over what goes on there, although they're not changing anything in the government. So that's a good example. And you can also have, fourthly here, economic imperialism. And economic imperialism basically is this idea that you don't really have a country controlling an area, but you do have a company controlling an area or territory, or in this case, we're looking at Hawaii and Dole Fruit. That is controlling an area. Dole Fruit came into Hawaii and pretty much took over pineapple production, all the other fruit production that is occurring in Hawaii, and one of Hawaii's main basic exports is going to be the fruit of the land there. And when Dole comes in and takes control of that, and they legally have contracts to extract the fruit, so to speak, they're pretty much in control of the entire economy of Hawaii during its colonial period. And this foreign company, Dole Fruit in this case, is exerting some amount of control. There are other notable examples of this, of course, but for our purposes and then for the time that we have here, that gives you a good example. So when a company comes in and pretty much controls a country based on its economy, that's economic imperialism. All right. So there are also two basic types of imperialism. Those are the sort of government forms that exist, but Europeans are going to use two basic methods to manage their colonies. Type 1, which we'll look at here, is called indirect control, and indirect control, like it sounds, is indirect. The countries generally, in these cases, will have limited self-rule for local governments. They do have or maintain a lot of the time their original governments. They have legislative bodies, and they sometimes are colonial. The local officials, tribal chiefs will sometimes stay in power. And again, examples of this are going to be like British colonies of Australia and Canada, which have their own governments and are generally speaking independent, but they're under the basically under the flag of or influenced by Britain. Okay, they're influenced by it. So Britain has some indirect control, but they allow the people there to govern for them. The U.S. control of the Philippines is another good example. The Philippines do have their own government, but were for a long time under some indirect control of the United States. The United States actually gave up the Philippines in 1947, shortly after World War II. So they are now a sovereign nation, but we did exert a lot of indirect control over them between the really early on in the 1900s and 1947. We still have some sphere of influence there too, but we don't really exert any governmental control there. There are also several British colonies in Africa, including Nigeria, which relied heavily on indirect control, and that worked fairly well, as we will see later on when we look at our case study of Nigeria. The other kind of imperialism that was present in Africa is going to be called direct control. And direct control imperialism basically is where European nations decided they wanted to rule directly over their new subjects. They wanted to basically govern them as an extension of their country. And in this case, Europeans basically believed that Africans were incapable of handling their complex job of running a country. They're not smart enough in the eyes of Europeans who wanted to use direct control to do anything that you would normally have to do in a European-style government. And to this end, two policies kind of occur here. And one of them is called paternalism. This is basically, and this is one of your vocab words, these two green words here, the policy of treating the subjects of a territory or country that you've taken over as if they were children, providing for them, obviously, making sure that everything goes well as far as living is concerned, but you're not giving them any rights. They are not allowed to govern themselves, and we're not looking at them as even capable of doing so. And there is a concept in world history called, quote, the white man's burden that kind of goes along with this. And the idea of the white man's burden basically is that Europeans were doing a service to the people they were colonizing, the people they were conquering, they were taking over, by governing them. They looked at the governments there and said, no, this is all wrong. You could be doing this so much better. We're not going to let you do that, but we're going to fix the problem for you because you're incapable. That was considered, quote-unquote, the white man or the European's burden. They were going to come in and fix these things. And I have no doubt on some level that there were a few countries out there that really, really did require the helping hand. There were some places that were very poorly governed and did need a more solvent, better government. However, the idea that Africans, for some reason, because they're Africans, are incapable of running a government is, to return to the point from Section 1, is simply just racist. But it might have been very difficult to teach them how to do it, but I have no doubt that they would have been capable given enough training. So there's that. But they looked at it from a paternalistic standpoint, that they're going to act as the parent here, they're going to take care of them, and they're going to run the country, but they're not going to give them any rights. That's kind of the idea of paternalism. And for some extent, the white man's burden. Now, also coming out of direct control, you see something called assimilation. And the French tried this a lot. The French, specifically in a lot of their colonies, would encourage or try to force the local people to take up the culture and institutions of the French, and assimilation is of any ruling people. But they would pretty much press French ideals, French culture, French language a lot of the time. That's why if you go to certain places in Africa, they will speak French. Good examples of this are, for example, Senegal, Seychelles, Togo, Tunisia, Egypt to some level speaks French, Cameroon, Burundi, Benin. There are a lot of Francophone countries in Africa, and that seems to have rubbed off in a lot of areas there. They don't necessarily retain French government, but there is some level of French culture in a lot of these places. The Ivory Coast, Djibouti, Chad. A lot of these places have literally now still the official language of French. So there is some level of assimilation that occurs in Africa, and a lot of this is due to, again, a direct control where Europeans are coming in and taking over the government of these colonies or these countries. All right. Now, let us go into then a case study of Nigeria. It is sort of a good look at kind of the imperialism that occurs in Africa. And we'll go back to Britain here for a moment, since we just got done with talking about France. Britain, well, and because Britain takes over Nigeria, so France is not even involved here. Britain conquers southern Nigeria using both diplomacy and force. And what I mean by that is that there are some negotiations going on with the rulers of Nigeria. Britain does go in. They don't immediately start having, to kill people or start wars with anyone. There is some amount of resistance in Nigeria to Britain taking over in the first place, but they do go in and negotiate at some points. And some rulers do agree, and they sign treaties, and they're okay with Britain being there. Some of them are actually appreciative in some cases, but some fought. There were skirmishes, there were battles that occurred in Nigeria over this process of imperial control being taken, and so there's some of that on both sides. So some were okay with it, some fought. It just depends. Conquest of northern Nigeria was accomplished especially through economic means. The British Royal Niger Company, which had controlled the palm oil trade there for some time, allowed Britain to kind of come in and claim that they were protecting this company. They were going to protect the Royal Niger Company, and thus they needed to be there to protect them. They came in, and as a result, in 1914, Britain actually claims all of Nigeria as a colony. They establish enough of a presence there that they're basically militarily able to take over and face very little resistance to speak of. To continue on with this, we're just looking at gaining control there. But let's look at how Britain managed its colony in Nigeria. And this is a good example of indirect control, or an attempt at indirect control. Nigeria is, to say the least, culturally diverse area. There are a lot of different culture and language groups there, and it's estimated that there are up to 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria, and that is a lot. You kind of don't think like a small area like Nigeria could really house that many different people, but around this period it does. And we're not going to talk about 250 of them. We're going to actually talk about 3. But British did attempt to use, or the British did attempt to use indirect control in Nigeria. That is, they didn't have a government. They didn't have government officials there that were ruling things. You didn't have a white Senate that sat around in Nigeria and ran everything. But they did exert control over the government from Britain. They set up a government institution in Nigeria to run the place, but local rulers were going to actually make the decisions on some level or another. And they used this successfully with a group called the Hausa Fulani, I believe is how that's pronounced. I hope that's how that's pronounced. The Muslims of the Hausa Fulani were okay with indirect control because they actually already had a strong centralized government in place. They were, let's say, more westernized, I suppose, if you want to look at it that way, than some of the other groups. And so indirect control was generally okay with this group. They were negotiated with, generally speaking, by the British. They had come to an agreement, and this group, the House of Fulani, were generally okay with continuing to govern the area under indirect control from Britain. So that worked out there. Unfortunately, 2 other notable tribes, the Yoruba and the Igbo, which if you read, there's a very famous book called Things Fall Apart. The main characters of that book are Igbo, as I recall. And these 2 more tribal type societies resent the limit of their power in indirect control, and this did not work very well. And they are often noted as having resisted this indirect control. Now, they're more like traditional African religions. They're not Muslim. They're not used to the government style of Europe or the Middle East, and so you know, these local chiefs are in power, and they don't want to give any of it up to Britain or outside control. So it didn't work as well in that particular case. So it works sometimes and doesn't work in others. Generally speaking, Britain was pretty successful in controlling Nigeria, but it did have some issues. Now, let's not say, by the way, that there wasn't just minor resistance to the idea of European imperialism. European imperialism was pretty universally resisted in Africa. Africans fought Europe often and frequently, and with great resolve in a lot of cases. This was not a, oh yeah, this kind of sucks, what should we do? It was a, you're in my country, get out now, I fight you kind of reaction that occurs. Africans pretty much never won against the Europeans. Unfortunately, Europeans, as we mentioned in Section 1, had better technology, they had better guns, they had things like the Maxim gun, which killed Africans in droves. Things like the Vickers would eventually show up. Other implements of war, of course, were very common in Africa, but Africans would often put up surprisingly effective offense against the Europeans. A good example of this, as you can see at the bottom here, is the Zulu versus the British. There are notable examples in the late 1800s. The British had created sort of a presence in South Africa, where the Zulu are, and they had come up with against a great amount of resistance. Specifically, a battle called the Battle of Isandlwana, I believe is how it's pronounced. Isandlwana, the battle that rocked Victorian Britain, as it is often called. The Zulus actually wiped out a substantial British force, including the 1st Battalion, 24th Foot, is what it was called. These were British with up-to-date military rifles. In 1879, I mean, they were well-trained soldiers. The problem is there just literally weren't enough of them to take on the Zulu army. This is part of, by the way, what is called the Anglo-Zulu War, or the Zulu-Anglo War. Obviously, the British fighting the Zulu. The British obviously eventually do win, but 12,000 British men were pretty much massacred at this battle. It did, however, I should mention, require 12,000 Zulu, but the Zulu beat them quite soundly. So let's not say that there was never an occurrence where the native Africans won, but it just wasn't very common. Some more specific failed attempts at resistance that we can talk about. Algeria actively resists the French for almost 50 years. They don't win, unfortunately, and Algeria is its own country now, so they are independent currently, but they resisted for a very long time. Another individual who is of note in West Africa is Samori Touré, and he fights against the French for about 16 years. Unfortunately, at the end of this 16 years of resistance, he is actually captured, put in prison, and actually dies in captivity around the turn of the century, following a bout of pneumonia. But he was successful in resisting for 16 years, which is rather impressive, especially against the French, who at that time, despite the jokes that are generally made about French military power, were quite powerful. Another notable example is in German East Africa. There was actually a movement called the Maji Maji religious movement, and basically these people were putting faith in a spiritual defense. Around 1905, the belief suddenly rose in this area that a magic water called Maji Maji, hence the name of the movement, sprinkled on their bodies would turn the German bullets into water. It would not hurt them. The problem with this is that Maji Maji water doesn't work. Over 20 different ethnic groups decided to unite to fight for their freedom in this case, and because they believed that the water would protect them, they went in with great resolve. The problem is when resistance fighters actually armed with spears and protected by this quote-unquote magic water attacked German machine gun posts, they were mowed down by the thousands. Officially, German records show that 75,000 resistors died. More than twice that number probably perished in the famine that followed. When that many people die in a battle, there's no one to run the fields. Farming goes kaput, and many people die as a result. So that is an unfortunate example as well of a failed resistance. And let's not think that these are the only resistance that occurred in Africa. Resistance efforts do generally fail during the period of European imperialism, but there are many, many others as well. Let's not get too down, however, because Ethiopia, the country basically that we know today as Ethiopia, does mount a successful resistance during this period. Ethiopia is what I like to call the rare exception to the rule of resistance being a failure. its victory is generally credited to this gentleman on the right called Menelik II. He is also one of your vocab words. And Menelik II was the emperor, he became emperor in 1899, of Ethiopia, who played the Italians, British, and French against each other and helped his nation stay independent. These nations were fighting in and amongst each other for control of Ethiopia. And while these nations fought, what Menelik did that a lot of other countries could not do or had not succeeded in doing is he put together a great stockpile of modern weapons. He stockpiled rifles, he stockpiled shotguns, he stockpiled cannons, in some case other things that were more powerful than that, for a possible fight against the Europeans. And when that day finally did come, what Italy actually attempted to take over Ethiopia, they had signed basically a peace agreement that the two different translations, the Ethiopian translation said it basically that Italy would leave them alone and everything was going to be cool, and the Italian version, they later found out, had different wording that basically allowed Italy to come in and take control over Ethiopia. And when Menelik found this out, the Ethiopian forces went to these large stores of modern weapons. They took them out, they loaded them up, and they fought very successfully against the Italians. They actually defeated the Italians in order to stay independent. So let's not think that there are no examples of African resistance being successful. But Ethiopia is one of those rare examples where it really was. And they are able to stay independent. Let's look at then the last thing here, the legacy of control or of colonial rule in Africa. And there are negative and positive effects. If you go to practically any historical event or period of time, there are negatives and positives to things occurring there. The negative effects in Africa are going to be various, but we'll look at a couple here. Africans are, of course, going to lose land and independence. When Europe comes in, they're obviously taking the land, they're taking control of their government in a lot of cases, and when they resist, a lot of people are going to lose their lives. It's just an unfortunate fact. Traditional cultures are going to break down, again, in places like Francophone or French West Africa. You're going to see a lot of traditional cultures go away. They're going to be supplanted by the French language, French government, French culture. So you are going to see, as an unfortunate result of colonial rule, a lot of these traditional cultures break down and go away. Divisions of Africa are also going to create problems that continue today. There are, I don't even know how many problems going on in Africa now that can at some point be linked to colonial rule. A lot of these countries are now independent of Europe, but because of the way that they were governed, and a lot of these countries were under direct control and paternalism, they didn't really know how to govern when Europe left. So there are a lot of problems that occur there still today because of colonial rule. But there are some positive effects of colonial rule, and a few of those are these. Colonialism reduced a lot of local fighting. When you are sort of forcibly united under the idea that you would like to resist Europe coming in, a lot of local fighting that used to occur there quickly ceased. When resistance was over as well, there was a lot of unity in the country, although a lot of it again was forced unity. But it does reduce local fighting, generally. Sanitation in Africa, generally speaking, improved. You have running water a lot of the time that is brought in by the Europeans who are governing there. Hospitals are created, which is always good for health and human services, that kind of thing. Schools are created, so education necessarily goes up. There were obviously, traditional modes of education in Africa previous to Europeans showing up, but these people are able to learn things like English, like French, German, Italian, etc. Depending on who was the leading power there. They're often exposed to science and math, which is despite what some high schoolers would believe, a really good thing. They're able to gain skills that without Europeans and without the education that they brought, they otherwise would not be able to get. Technology is also brought with Europeans, and not necessarily just guns and that kind of thing to kill Africans, but things like cars eventually are brought in, boats, steamboats to go up and down river. It not only increased the facility of Europeans traveling, but also those of Africans. Electricity is brought into Africa in a lot of cases, so you can have things like electric lights and factories that eventually come there. Manufacturing technology, especially in textiles, is brought to Africa, so better clothes occur there. We can go through myriad technologies that are brought through Africa that do improve the economic growth of Africa, things that just were not there before. Things like railroads are brought in to move all these things. Dams, telephones, telegraph lines are built in African colonies. For the most part, obviously these things are going to benefit only European business interests and not African lives, but some of them eventually kind of trickle through to the native people of these areas. In Section 3, we will see that the patterns of behavior in imperialist powers were similar no matter where their colonies were located. Dealing with local traditions and people continues to be a problem and cause problems in other areas of the world dominated by Europeans. In this section, number 3, we're going to see that resistance to European imperialism also continues in other parts of the world. Thanks for listening. Hopefully if you missed any of this in class, you're now being filled in. Bye. See you guys in class. Be good. Don't forget to be awesome.